startling reality of what was going on. In slow motion, you can see a Boeing 767, a passenger plane, crashing into the South Tower.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
It is hard to imagine what was going through the minds of people on the ground, suddenly vulnerable on the American mainland. President Bush was visiting a school in Florida.
I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
But it wasn't over, not by a long way. Almost as soon as the president had finished speaking, another airliner crashed on the Pentagon, the headquarters of the American Defense Department, causing panic in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The White House was evacuated, and there was a car bomb attack on the State Department, which runs American foreign policy. Back in New York, firefighters went to the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above them was safe. But the nightmare went on, and it was all live on American television. First, one of the Twin Towers collapsed.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
The emergency services had cleared an area around the towers, but they'd not yet succeeded in evacuating the building. The people still inside had seen the other tower go and waved in desperation. Some couldn't wait to be rescued and jumped, although still 100 stories from the ground. But then the second tower collapsed. BBC correspondent Stephen Evans had run from the World Trade Center.
People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. Right, well, sorry, it's going down. It's going down. Don't worry, it's going down. We're okay from here. But you need to shoot, so it's not like And then the World Trade Center, proud symbol that it was of the wealthiest city in the world, was no more. At that time of the morning, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center and thousands more in the Wall Street financial district around it. The emergency services have been doing what they can all day, but they are overwhelmed by demand in an atmosphere of terror. Every airliner in the air across America was ordered to land at the nearest airport. A plane crashed in Pittsburgh. As smoke blew across Capitol Hill, the heart of American democracy, it is clear that this is the biggest attack on America since Pearl Harbor.
Once again, we see terrorism. We see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
This is what's left of the World Trade Center. It looks like a battlefield, and it is, but in a war which America cannot fight with the weapons they have. In a brief break in the day, firefighters could embrace each other, but it will be many hours before their work is done, and many years before the full story of what this day means is told.
Now with me here, and I'll be talking to them in a moment, Professor Gallia, who's an expert in fire safety and knows about the time it takes to evacuate a building like that, and David Learmont of Flight International. But I want, first of all, to go to the BBC's New York business correspondent, Paddy O'Connell, who was there today. Where were you when this happened, Paddy?
Personally, I was in the subway. There's an economic conference on at the World Trade Center that we were attending. In a moment, more from my colleague Steve Evans, who you saw briefly there, who was in the Trade Center when it happened. I was on the subway and my whole morning was spent with people trying to get away from the scene.
Did you hear anything at the time? Did you know anything was happening?
Yes, it was just as the skyline has been altered, it became clear that this is a city whose lifestyle is being altered as we speak. The transportation system ground to a halt. Phone calls were useless. You couldn't use cell phones. I went into a shop to try and use their phone. There was a line of people trying to use it. Then the line went dead. Then, as the whole impression of what had happened spread by word of mouth at this stage, street by street, as you headed north away from the World Trade Center, the streets were shut down. Therefore, more and more people were hearing by mouth and then gathering behind me in Times Square in the conventional New York through history, the way to learn news, although this time about an attack on their own city and elsewhere. And we'll bring you in a moment, David, some of what they were telling us. But first, the full impact was seen in the moment in time. My colleague Stephen Evans, who was in the Trade Center and was interviewed just after the first explosion.
There was another big explosion in the other tower. Flames coming out in this billowing grey smoke. People still not panicking. People not quite understanding what was going on. Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. The thing that strikes me is, one, the terribleness of the incident, whatever the cause, and we don't go into politics, but whatever the cause, the terribleness, the hugeness of what's happened. So huge, in fact, that most of the people around simply can't understand what happened. People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta go. Oh my God.
These pictures then of the immediate aftermath. David, behind me in Times Square, phalanxes of people all day, tourists and people headed north, remember, trying to get away, to get home, and at the moment they're stranded. They were speaking to us, giving their reaction on what had happened in their city.
I'm glad to be alive. I mean, there was a total stampede of people. I fell a couple of times, got, slightly trampled, but I walked away with just a scratched knee. So I'm just trying to get home right now to be with my family.
Were you working downtown? Is that what?
Yes, I work on Wall Street, 14 Wall Street, and the devastation is unbelievable. And I'm quite sure that the loss of life is enormous.
It's a very densely packed area down there. Were you with people you knew? Did you lose people at the moment you can't find?
Currently, right now, there is a friend of mine that worked in the second tower, and I tried to call her this morning when I heard about the first plane crashing into the building, and I have not been able to reach her.
We still don't know the magnitude of it, and it's just horrible.
Do you live and work in the city?
I work in the city.
What's your day been like?
Chaotic. Everyone fleeing from downtown, getting as far away from the chaos as possible, and not knowing what's going to happen next. Just horrible.
Where did you go first? Where were you when it happened?
I was in Midtown, and I walked towards Central Park with hundreds of other people just going away from the chaos of Wall Street.
We're in shock. I mean, the enormity of it and the the significance of it hasn't filtered through yet, I don't think. But everyone's walking along. I mean, I walked up from 25th Street, up Broadway, and I mean, people are walking around in shock, literally.
Do you think it's going to be long for that to turn to anger among people?
No, I don't, actually. I think that reaction will happen pretty quickly.
This is like Pearl Harbor. This is like an act of war. And I think that whatever retribution they can, I mean, I'm eye for an eye, and all that, but something's got to be done. We can't live like this. This is the capital of the world. More business is done here between 60th Street and downtown Manhattan than any place else in the world. The whole world is responsible for this area here.
I checked on every single person I know. The co-worker I work with, she was very distressed. Her boyfriend she works on the 92nd floor, and she hasn't heard from him ever since. And we've been talking for like about 4 hours, trying to get in contact, and she hasn't seen him. She hasn't heard from him. So other than that, my family's good, but I don't know how she's going to do.
It's unbelievable. Got to work, I thought it was a normal, every other kind of day, and then everything changed. My life will never be the same, even though I had nobody, you know, personally involved in what's happened today. I don't think things can ever go back to the way they were. So I'm...
Stephen Evans, we're hearing there people saying things will never be the same and talking about the sense of shock. How do you think things will change for New York?
It's very difficult to say. That thing happened, what is it, something like 7 hours ago, and it's still not real to me. It simply isn't real. People were wandering away, not being able to believe what had happened. You do change in strange ways. If you see people looking up into the sky, you suddenly get a frisson of fear. So that kind of fear is rippling through all those people who are there. And remember, 50,000 people work in those buildings. It was something like 9:15 in the morning. In the commercial capital of the world, you don't get times more busy than that. So I think an awful lot of people would have gone away from that thing and simply thought and ruminated about it. And that sort of shock takes time to come to you and then to get over it.
And is there any news about the number of dead, or indeed whether there are people injured and being taken out of the rubble of those towers that collapsed?
Not news that I've got. Obviously, you've just got to look at those pictures and realize that something very major has happened. One of the things that struck me was that people didn't move away immediately. People moved, if you like, I don't know, 100 meters away, but there were then explosions later. I noticed about an hour later, for example, in the street where I was, there were about 100 ambulances queuing up to get into the building. The emergency services were thick on the ground very, very quickly. But there was that second explosion and the collapse of the building. I'm not sure that the emergency services quite realized what was about to happen. There was a cloud of smoke. I don't quite know what the impact of that would have been.
And what was the...
You don't imagine that an airliner is going to crash into a building like that. Nobody quite knew what the engineering implications were. My suspicion is that there were casualties way after the initial impact.
And what was the mood actually in the street? We saw you as that building collapsed. Did people panic after that, or were they just aghast and standing watching?
It was genuinely very impressive. Clearly people were panicking, people were shocked, and you could see tears in their eyes and you could hear the shaking in their voices. But I didn't hear many people screaming, and I didn't hear anybody clambering to get over anybody else, if you like. I was evacuated from a hotel about 200 meters from the thing about an hour after the initial blast. There was a disabled lady trying to get downstairs. She was being very, very slow, and people were saying, hold on a minute, I'll help you down. So there was something uplifting, really, in the aftermath of all that.
Steve, thanks very much. We may have a chance to talk to you later about some of the other implications and the implications on the American economy, the world economy of what happened. But I'm joined now by Professor Galea, who's an expert in fire safety, and the specific thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know you've studied the time when the World Trade Center was bombed and the time it took to get people out. In terms of what happened today, would it have been possible to evacuate those buildings between the time that the aeroplane crashed into the tower and the time that the towers collapsed?
Well, going back to the experience of the '93 bombing, the first tower that actually took the brunt of the explosion, about 50% of the occupants of that building took between 1 to 3 hours to get out. Some people took considerably longer than that, aged people, disabled people and so on, but about 50-odd% of the people required up to 3 hours to evacuate. Now the building collapsed in a good deal less than 3 hours. So I would suspect that a lot of people would have been caught in the building.
It's such a huge building. When the airplane struck it, would people have realized what was happening, or would some people have been completely ignorant of what was going on until the building collapsed around them?
They're both extremely large buildings. They're 110 stories, a quarter of a mile high. a lot of the people in the building, in fact the majority of the people, wouldn't have realised what was going on. They would have felt a shudder, they would have heard the explosion, but they wouldn't really have realised what was going on. And so a lot of the people would not have reacted as you would expect them to get up and leave. A lot of people would have been wondering what was going on, getting onto the phone, looking out windows, trying to find out what was going on. Again, going back to the experience in the '93 incident, on average, it took 15 minutes for people before they actually decided that something was going on that they needed to evacuate.
And are you saying that even if people wanted to get out and even if the escape had been planned, it would still take 2 or 3 hours to get everybody out of a building that size? It would
take that long to get out. The buildings are not designed to evacuate the entire population of the building immediately. The evacuation strategy would be to, in the event of a fire, to evacuate the fire floor, the floor above, and 3 floors below, and everyone else is expected to stay in place.
Professor Galea, thank you very much. Well, let's turn and talk about the other aspect of this, the 4 aeroplanes that were hijacked and used for these attacks. 4 American airline flights destroyed with all their passengers, with the flight attendants, with the pilots. 2 of them were American Airlines. Flight 11, a Boeing 767 with 81 passengers, which crashed at first into the World Trade Center. Another, Flight 77, a Boeing 757 from Dulles Airport near Washington on its way to Los Angeles, which crashed into the second World Trade Center tower with 58 passengers on board. And then a United Airlines Flight 175, which was bound from Boston to Los Angeles, carrying 56 passengers. That was the one that crashed into the Pentagon building. And then the United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757, which crashed southeast of Pittsburgh while en route from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco with 38 passengers on board. Now, I'm joined here by David Learmont of Flight International and by Chris Hodgkinson, who's an airline pilot. One can only imagine the horror of what went on in those planes. A lot of speculation has been that the people who hijacked them actually took over the controls of the plane and flew them into these towers. Do you agree with that?
I would go along with the fact that they probably, the people who hijacked the aircraft may well have been those who aimed the aircraft at the buildings. But remember, we've never seen hijacks like this before, and the pilots will not have been ready for anything remotely like this. The hijackers may have acted to start with like ordinary hijackers and used the pilots to navigate them to, let's say, take me to New York. As you recall, one of the flights took off from Boston and ended up hitting the towers in New York. So they may well have pretended to be ordinary hijackers who wanted a destination. Then, when they got there, it would have been easy to have disposed of the pilots, you know, got them, either shot them, or whatever weaponry. We don't have any idea of what weaponry these people had to threaten the pilots with, so we don't know exactly what the pilots underwent. But air controls are sufficiently intuitive that even a relatively untrained person, if their only task was to aim at something and hit it, they could probably have done that.
Chris Hodgkinson, would the people controlling these flights, after all, we're talking about an area which probably has more flights in it than any other part of the world almost, except for the surrounds of Heathrow, would they have known what was going on, had any inkling of what was happening, or would these be planes that just disappeared from their control?
That, I'm sure, remains a matter of conjecture at this stage. What the air traffickers thought, I'm sure, will come out in the inquiry, but I have no indication at this stage as to what
are pilots trained to do in circumstances like this?
The training that a pilot is given is basically to use his common sense. It's extremely difficult to control security once people are on the aircraft. Someone made a comment to me earlier this evening. Aircraft security stops at the aircraft side, and I would suggest that for the vast majority of airliners in the world, that is the case. You then have to judge the situation, the captain has to judge the situation as he finds it, and act accordingly.
But are you critical of the security controls in the United States? Because you think that could have happened from Heathrow or from any European airport?
Security is very good generally. Around the world there are 1 or 2 places which is not quite so good, but I would suggest to you that if a determined effort was made, it is practically impossible to stop it, sadly.
David Emma, do you agree with that? That an armed gang of hijackers can get on any plane anywhere in the world?
It is absolutely staggering that 4 hijacks should be able to take place in America all at the same time, all coordinated. Now, there's a great anomaly with American security. In President Clinton's first term of office, he actually set up a commission under Vice President Gore to study the needs for aviation security in America. And this, the report suggested a major ramping up of aviation security throughout throughout America, domestic America, and internationally. Now, it was fully implemented for their international flights, but the airlines who operate domestically protested that it would slow the system down too much. So the government listened to them and did not ramp up security internally. And all these flights, it is not an accident that all these flights were domestic flights. That was America's weakest point, and the terrorists knew this.
And they just didn't take the threat seriously in the United States.
I'm not saying there's no security on domestic flights in the USA. That's not right. You will have your bag x-rayed, etc. But you've no idea the difference between domestic air travel in America and domestic air travel in this country or in Europe. It's much more a sausage machine over there. Everything is processed very much faster, very much more peremptorily. The aircraft are turned round very much faster. The whole thing is geared to speed. It's much more for an American who travels regularly domestically, like getting on board a bus. It is an everyday occurrence.
So it would have been much harder to have done this kind of thing in Europe.
It would have been,
in the United States, is your opinion?
It's not impossible to do this anywhere. I don't think it was an accident that they didn't try to do this with an American international flight, because security on American flights internationally is very good. And certainly security even for domestic flights in Europe is a lot better than it is on domestic flights in the USA, and this is now going to change forever.
David, thank you very much. Robert Hall is at Heathrow this evening. The impact of this on the aviation business, of course, and on airlines all over the world is huge. But what is the position tonight down at Heathrow, Robert?
Well, it's interesting that thousands of people, of course, using that Atlantic route, David, but at first a lot of them would have known that something was amiss, that something terrible was unfolding, was when they heard that Tannoy announcement on their aircraft telling them that they were turning back, because every single transatlantic flight this afternoon that was on its way across and hadn't reached the point of no return, i.e. had enough fuel to get back, did just that, and those passengers are beginning to arrive back now. Just the start of what could be a long period of disruption.
Have you been talking to people in the airline industry about their reaction?
I think there's a feeling of disbelief throughout the airport, not only amongst the passengers, but amongst the professionals here. Thousands of people who knew it might happen, some of whom are trained to face it, but can't quite believe it has happened. I've been joined here by Kevin Crehan. Now, he is a member of the cabin crew for United. You also represent the union that looks after the cabin crew. You've just set up a crisis centre. You've come from there. When you walked into the airport this afternoon and faced the staff, how were people taking it in? How could they take it in?
Well, it's a shock. Actually, it goes beyond shock. It's a numbness. When this afternoon when I learned of it, I was down in Brighton. I took the train back, and when I arrived, it was different. Just the feeling as you walked into Terminal 3. It was just this stillness. The faces on the staff. You know, people are trained to deal with certain amount of emergency activities, so they know this is the type of risk that can result in disaster. But it was a shocking numbness that I found when I arrived at the airport today.
And presumably part of the crisis centre is to offer those people counselling if they need it, because I don't know, but nobody knows yet the composition of who was lost. Yeah. But presumably people here may have lost friends.
Yeah, the crisis centre is set up to deal with all aspects of the airline in recovering. And the role of the Association of Flight Attendants is to deal with the emotional trauma of the staff. We're trained in critical incident response, and actually just this past month, very coincidentally, we had a very good joint training with the local management and local union reps on how do you deal with the aftermath. And it's really the emotional trauma that we'll be looking after.
Just one question. We talked about preparedness. We've just been hearing from our aviation expert in the studio about the lack of preparedness, in his view, on US internal flights. How would you react to that?
Well, I wouldn't call it a lack of preparedness. There's certainly a different level of security for an internal flight in the U.S. versus an international flight. And I think that's true here at Heathrow, where a flight that leaves Terminal 3 internationally has a very high level of security, and a flight that's leaving perhaps out of Terminal 1 may have a different level of security for a domestic flight. And it's quite the same in the U.S. The same analogy would apply.
Can you see this bringing about a review? I mean, as far as your members are concerned, can you see your members asking now for changes?
I'm sure that this is going to cause people to worry about the security procedures in effect. I'm definitely sure that they will be asking for changes. This is the type of thing, though, when we have an incident like this, the union management, the security professionals within the FAA, the CAA, everybody gets together to review what has happened and how to respond. And, you know, what was it, if there was anything that was avoidable.
Thank you very much for those. Just one closing point from here, David. I think although there's a heightened level of security, a greater sense of alert here, it's fair to say that passengers are philosophical about it. After all, what disruption they're suffering is as nothing compared to the tragedy that's unfolding across the Atlantic.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's 4 o'clock in New York, and we go back there to see the latest scenes of how this southern half of the city still completely shrouded in smoke. You'll have seen those pictures we showed earlier on of the whole place erupting with smoke and dust. Well, there is the World Trade Center as it is this afternoon in New York, abandoned. It's like the scenes from bombing in the Second World War, even perhaps of Hiroshima. They're not on that scale, but it is the most devastating. I said at the beginning, this is 21st century war. What we don't yet know is who's behind it all. Two extremist Palestinian groups already denied that it was them. American intelligence has said their suspicions have already fallen upon one man, the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden, who's been public enemy #1 in the States since the revelation that he was behind the World Trade Center bombing 8 years ago. Now, Panorama's reporter Jane Corbin has actually been on bin Laden's trail for the last few years.
He's the world's most wanted man with a $3 million price on his head, accused of masterminding a series of terror attacks. Osama bin Laden, a man born into a wealthy Saudi family who rejected his heritage to form a revolutionary organization, Al-Qaeda, or the Base. From his hideout in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden's mission is to provide the ideological encouragement and sometimes the cash and the logistical support behind attempts to bring death to America and American citizens around the globe. 3 years ago, his organization was behind the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi in Kenya. 6 Americans died and nearly 200 Africans, many in a 23-story building alongside the embassy, were killed. As the emergency services rushed to the scene, came news of a second bomb exploding almost simultaneously in the U.S. Embassy in neighboring Tanzania. It was proof that Osama bin Laden could organize a sophisticated series of bombs. 2 men were picked up within days of the bombing, Mohammed Al-Awali, a Yemeni, and Jordanian Mohammed Odeh. They admitted they were working for Osama bin Laden, who's always made clear he believes the US is a legitimate target.
They are the spearhead that has killed the people of this religion. Every effort that is made against America and the Jews yields positive and great direct results. He who can kill an American soldier, this is much better for him than expending his efforts on other matters.
Last October, those words of Mr. bin Laden seemed to have been acted upon when terrorists blew themselves up in a boat alongside an American warship, the USS Cole, in the port of Aden in the Yemen. 17 sailors were killed and 38 injured. The inquiry into the bombing is still going on. Mr. bin Laden has never claimed responsibility for this and other terror attacks, but Washington is convinced that he has backed and encouraged groups of Islamic fundamentalists with grievances against America.
he always deliberately maintained his distance from terrorist attacks. When you look at Osama bin Laden and his network, his financial network, it's rather like peeling an onion, skin by skin.
But perhaps the strongest indication that Osama bin Laden may be behind today's terror attacks is the involvement of his organization in the bombing of the World Trade Center 8 years ago. 6 people died in that explosion, which did limited damage to the building. When the master bomber, Ramzi Youssef, was caught, he was found to have names in his notebook which matched people in Osama bin Laden's terror network.
We knew at the time that Ramzi Youssef and his associates had outside support. They had to have finance, logistical, training, and other types of support. And now it appears very likely that the bin Laden network was the ultimate supporter of that operation and the planned follow-up operations.
Jane Corbin, well, I've been joined by a number of other guests I'll introduce in just a moment, but Jane Corbin, on the bin Laden connection, it's always very dangerous to leap to a conclusion within hours of something happening, but is there something in what happened today that makes you think that he's the likeliest suspect?
Well, as you saw in that report, his followers were believed to be behind the World Trade Center bombing 8 years ago. And the investigators told us that they actually found a lot of evidence to suggest that those bombers were planning a much bigger attack on New York to paralyze it in effect by targeting tunnels, railway lines and bridges. And perhaps most significantly of all, 11 planes, it was planned, would be hijacked and blown up on the ground. Now, you know, I think one has to realize that that was obviously going to be a very big operation. They didn't succeed in it, and what we've seen today has involved a lot of planes and a series of explosions, and I think a lot of people will draw some parallels between perhaps a failed attempt 8 years ago and replanning for today.
And are you surprised, if it is him, that it was possible to do this without any intelligence apparently leaking, or were there signs that something was afoot?
There were signs coming from papers in the Arab region about 3 weeks ago that he had said to followers that he was going to have a big push against America, that a big attack was in the offing. And certainly intelligence agencies in a number of countries were warning people of this. So there seems to have been some indication that something was in the offing. And of course the thing about Osama bin Laden is it's very difficult to pin him down with his connections to myriads of groups, because of the way he operates, which is to give backing, encouragement, but to stay back from the operation, while very small groups allied to a number of causes and a number of grievances actually go out and do the bombing.
Well, if this is the correct explanation of what happened, what is his motivation? What's behind it? What's he trying to do?
He became involved in Afghanistan, where he lives now, when the original Afghan freedom fighters, the so-called Mujahideen, were fighting against the Soviet invasion. He's a Saudi, and when the Americans came into Saudi in the operation to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi control, Osama bin Laden was enraged by this. I think he saw it as a form of imperialism, and since that day he declared war on America. So the motivation is quite hard to pin down, but there seems to be a great anger at the root of it against America and of course against Israel, where of course it finds a ready response in a number of Arab countries, and has done in recent months, where we've seen an upsurge of violence in the Middle East.
America's tried previously to find him and kill him. Is there any hope they can catch him, or is he so well concealed in Afghanistan or wherever he is that that won't prove possible?
Well, of course, after the Nairobi bombing, they did bomb a number of his training camps in Afghanistan. They failed to get him. He's under the protection of the Taliban, who have resolutely refused to give him up. He is obviously a man, a fugitive, who lives in this way. It's not going to be easy.
Jane, thanks very much. Let's join Jane Stanley now, who's in New York this afternoon. Jane, good afternoon. We can see the smoke still billowing out behind you. Has the mood changed in New York in these 7 hours?
I don't think it has really. It went from a very early disbelief as these events unfolded live on American television screens. People saying, oh, this is like a movie, I couldn't believe that this would happen. And I think then to utter horror as the Twin Towers collapsed. And the only change really, I think, has been a deepening of the sickness that people feel here, a deepening of the fear, because as we can see with the smoke still billowing out of the World Trade Center and the horror that lies underneath that rubble, people are very frightened about what is going to be found there, because we still have no idea of fatalities. On casualties, we know 600 people are in the city's hospitals and 1,500 more are being treated at a 10 hospital set up in Liberty Island Park out in the Bay of New York. But still, no way of coming to terms with something like this.
Are the rescue services at work on the site, on the rubble of those two huge buildings, or is it a place it's impossible to conceive anybody could remain alive underneath?
It's hard to know, because behind me, where the Twin Towers are, just beyond that, the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has actually closed down the majority of the city. He's just forced a line, and everyone else has been evacuated out. We see behind us regularly coming ambulances, sirens wailing of people. We really have no idea who's being taken from the scene. But of course, rescue efforts are still going on. But when you think of 110 stories, 2 towers falling down, it's a huge area that will have been devastated, very hard to get at. And of course the city, the Red Cross here, appealing for blood donors, people being treated for burns. But kind of as the downtown area, the financial area of Manhattan behind me has been closed down, in many ways so has the information network. For example, we're hearing nothing at all on fatalities. Perhaps it's too horrible for the authorities here to even contemplate yet.
Jane, thank you very much. We know perhaps slightly less about what happened in Washington at the Pentagon building, where a plane also crashed into the side of the building there. And of course, as in Manhattan, many people already at work. People go to work at 7:30 in the morning, and it was already 9 o'clock before this plane crash happened. And then the 4th plane, which one congressman has said may have been on its way to Camp David when it crashed. Though we don't know anything about that. But Tom Carver is in Washington and has just been to a Pentagon briefing. Can you throw more light on what actually happened at the Pentagon as a result of that crash, Tom?
Actually, in fact, it was a White House briefing. So let me just tell you what President Bush's movements are at the moment. He is at an Air Force base, a remote Air Force base in Nebraska, and within the next hour he is going to be convening his National Security Council by phone. We understand that Dick Cheney will be heading the National Security Council meeting in the Situation Room in the White House just behind me here. That's basically the war room underneath the White House. With him is Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of Transportation. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, will be at the Pentagon and also obviously taking part. And they will essentially be assessing the situation, trying to diagnose who carried out these attacks and what the response is going to be. Karen Hughes was the White House spokeswoman, and I believe we may have a short piece of video of her.
Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks.
Tom, what news do you have about what actually happened to the Pentagon building itself and what the scale of the casualties there were?
What happened, as we understand it, as eyewitnesses describe it, is that an American Airlines plane came in at an incredibly steep descent and hit the ground floor of the Pentagon on one of the wings. It completely destroyed the side of the Pentagon, all 6 stories of it, and as far as we know, is still completely embedded in it. The last I saw of the Pentagon, and there is smoke still rising, I don't know if you can see it over my shoulder, but the Pentagon is in the distance, smoke is still coming out of it. There are obviously a lot of casualties there, but the only small bright spot is that in fact it was an area of the Pentagon that had just been renovated, and a number of the offices were empty at the time. The Chief of the Naval Staff, Chief of Naval Operations, we understand, had his office there. That's a 3-star general. He, in fact, is okay, I've been told, but obviously a number of very senior and high-ranking, mainly naval officials, appear to have been in that part of the Pentagon, and their fate at the moment is unknown.
How long after the New York attack was the Washington attack, Tom? And there was some talk about the Pentagon being evacuated earlier today, but clearly it wasn't evacuated by the time the plane struck.
That's right. The call for evacuation went out a few minutes before the plane struck, apparently in response to the World Trade Center attacks, which happened about 20 minutes before. They were in the process of beginning that evacuation when the plane struck the Pentagon. So they hadn't begun it. Obviously, the evacuation happened immediately afterwards, and the Pentagon, at the moment, except for emergency personnel, such as the Secretary of Defense, remains completely empty at this stage. There's a lot of speculation here in Washington, obviously, that the 3 attacks were well coordinated. And I should say that the mood on Congress is also very grim. The whole of Congress has been evacuated. A number of senior congressional figures are calling this America's Pearl Harbor. It's a very grim day up on Capitol Hill, and they are trying to establish an air of calm, but it doesn't look good when the actual seat of government itself in Washington at the moment is empty.
Tom, thank you very much.